Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. I am honored to take this opportunity on behalf of Institute of Directors to welcome you all to this webinar on NRC, the Game Changer Board Committee. I am Brigadier Rajeev Kapoor, the Regional Director, IOD Bangalore, and your host for today's webinar. Let me first thank and express our sincere gratitude to all our sponsors who came forward in making this event come together. Next slide, please. Let me thank, Let me thank Mr. Pushp Joshi, Director HR HPCL, for being our webinar partner, Mr. VN Dutt, Chairman and Managing Director, National Fertilizers Limited, Dr. SP Mohanty, Chairman and Managing Director, HIL India Limited. I extend my gratitude and appreciate that you and your team has taken out time to join us in this webinar. Thank you very much, sir, for all these help extended. Now, let me take this opportunity to take you through the entire sequence. This webinar has been divided into 2 sessions, wherein we have amongst us some very distinguished personalities possessing vast knowledge on the subject. The first keynote speaker shall be talking about the importance of NRC and what it can do for the organization. The second speaker shall be sharing his views on what the management expects from the NRC. Ladies and gentlemen, due to prior commitments of each keynote speaker, we have split the question answer session after each keynote speaker delivers his talk. Also, I would request the audience to type their questions in brief in the chat box as shown in the control panel. Before we start with the second session, there will be a 10 minutes interlude wherein a distinguished colleague of ours will talk about the biography of the eminent jurist who is also the National Chairman of Institute of Directors. And we all in IOD hold him in high esteem. And this is our tribute to him. Against this backdrop, we have 3 distinguished speakers lined up for the second session, and each shall be giving a 15-minute talk on key roles and how these roles are changing, especially with the challenges posed by this pandemic. After the presentation, it will be followed by a question answer session. The same rule applies regarding the posting of questions in the chat box. We have also requested each speaker to give their recommendation, and we propose to compile and publish it in our monthly IOD magazine in the next issue of Directors Today. Now, commencing with the program with just few words of introduction for all our speakers, let me start with Mr. Arun Balakrishnan, who shall commence with the opening remarks. Mr. Arun Balakrishnan is the former Chairman and Managing Director of Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Limited, a Fortune 500 company. He has also been the founder chairman of HPCL Mittal Energy Limited, a petroleum refining company conceived as public-private partnership. Apart from being on a number of boards, he is also the chairman of Institute of Directors Bangalore chapter. Now, may I call upon Mr. Arun Balakrishnan to kindly come forward and deliver your address, sir?
Yeah. Thank you, Rajeev. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The theme for this webinar is NRC, the Game Changer Board Committee. I presume that some of you may find it unusual that IOD has chosen to talk about a board committee when the normal trend is to cover a much wider spectrum of the role of the board in the management of a company. All the committees of the board are important and has been created for a purpose. The role of CSR committee and the stockholders relationship committee do not require much elaboration as it is very self-evident. Generally, the Audit Committee takes a pride of place amongst the board committees under the Companies Act 2013 and even specifies that the independent directors, who are the majority members in this committee, have at least a basic knowledge of finance and accounting, and rightfully so. The quarterly and annual results of the company, certified by the statutory auditors, are recommended for board approval and offers to the investors a glimpse of the company's health. The Risk Management Committee provides a view of what can go wrong and the probability of such events happening and the magnitude of its impact. But these companies do not fully reflect the requisites for shaping the future of the organization. The brain trust of IOD Bangalore have been debating which committee of the board can have long-term impact on the organization. A metric, I know, that is not easy to define. This is when we came to the hypothesis that the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, NRC in short, must take the mantle to ensure the company has the right people to meet the aspirations of its investors and ensure that the environment and the society in which it operates are not negatively impacted. A committee that should comprise of people who are sagacious, have the right values, understand the fast-changing trends in science and technology, and they know how to get the best possible people on board the corporate bus, and put in place an attractive and transparent culture and reward system to retain them, making the organization a great place to work, and equally important, contribute to the well-being of its stakeholders and customers. After all, it is the NRC that helped bring in the independent directors. The IDs in turn bring in new knowledge and experience from other companies and sectors of the economy. This enriches the board, especially when they challenge the management's belief and practices. Such interventions can range from questioning untenably high levels of remuneration to CEOs, ensuring gender diversity and fair performance management systems. And I would add board and director appraisals that would serve as a good feedback to those at the helm. At this juncture of our lives, I cannot but talk about COVID-19, the elephant in the room, and its impact on the country's economy and profitability and growth of organizations. Multiple vaccines may mitigate the infection, but what scares me is the aftermath, what scientists call the long COVID. They say for up to 3 to 6 months after recovery, there could be after effects such as fatigue and brain fog. I have seen brain fog in people who have recovered over a month after, unable to hold their focus on any issue even for 2 minutes to 5 minutes. NRC needs to address these issues as employees who join back after recovery from their COVID with brain fog can disrupt the organization, be it manufacturing, finance, marketing, or any other vertical. We have been privileged in getting the consent of distinguished speakers for this webinar, those who have had years of board experience and some who are acknowledged specialists in their area of work. These speakers have the knowledge and courage to express their views on why the NRC is indeed a game-changer committee of the board, shaping people, culture, and values. We have also requested each speaker to offer their recommendations for what more can be done to keep the NRC at the cutting edge. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please stay logged in for a riveting 2 hours of knowledge input. And thank you. And over to you, Brigadier Rajeev Kapoor, our Master of Ceremonies for this webinar, to take the proceedings forward.
Thank you very much, sir, for setting the context for this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, now without further any addition, let us focus towards our first distinguished speaker for the day, Mr. Rajeev Dube. An accomplished leader with strong background in management, Mr. Dube has led several organizations across industries, creating high-performing teams and successful businesses, growing market share, generating revenue stream, and building sustainable brands. In the last 17 years, Mr. Rajeev Dube has been associated with Mahindra Limited, heading various verticals. Currently, he is the chairman of Mahindra Insurance Brokers Limited, MIBL, Mahindra Steel Center Limited, Mahindra First Wheels Limited, and also director on the board of Fifth Gear Venture Limited. Earlier to this, he was the CEO of Tata, Netflix, and Rallies India for over 7 years as part of his 21-year stint with the Tatas. An alumni of St. Stephen's College and Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University, where he stood first in the university and also earned his scholarship. He did his MBA from Yale School of Management, USA, and was also selected as the distinguished alumnus of the institution. I now call upon Mr. Rajeev Dube to deliver the keynote address. Over to you, Mr. Rajeev Dube.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rajeev. I am privileged and honored to be speaking to you.
Thank you very much,
let
sir.
me start off. Can I have my slides, please? Can I have the first slide, please, Rajeev?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Ravi, just kindly do the needful, please.
Yeah, okay. So the next slide, please. Yeah. So let me start off by telling you, it's not a story, it's a real life experience which stretched over 24 years. As many of you may know, Mr. Anand Mahindra is going to retire from his executive position very shortly. And it's a huge, potentially game-changing moment for the group, because Anand has been at the helm of affairs for more than 2.5 decades. He is a very powerful leader. He has created a culture. He's known all over the world. And he is a larger-than-life influence on a large part of people in the group and outside. Now, the choice of his successor would make a huge difference to what happens going forward. And the board of M&M actually brought in the what we call the GNRC, Governance, Nomination and Remuneration Committee, but we are calling it today the NRC, 24 months before the change of guard was to take place. And this board appointed a subcommittee with which I work very, very closely. And we actually spent hours and hours and hours and hours over 24 months debating questions like, given the future plans of the group, given the state of change that is taking place around us, what are the qualities that we should be looking for in the incoming CEO? And why should we be looking at those qualities and skills? And what should be the ranking of these? Then the next question was, are there any consequent organizational structure changes that are required? Do we need to change the team that he'll be working with? Because many of Mr. Mahindra's close first line team, including this bearded gentleman that you see, were going to retire. Some of us a few months before him, some after him. So what kind of team? Do we need to make organizational changes? Are there decision-making processes that need to be changed? What is the process that we should follow in doing all this? And who should be the keeper of the process? What should be the timelines, milestones? Where should we be looking for the pool of candidates? Should we be looking only inside or should we be looking outside? What are the pros and cons? Then when we have finally selected, when the committee has selected, when should we put it up to the board? And then what should be the process of communication? First to the person who's being selected, then to the others, then to the rest of the organization. How do we then keep it secret? Should we first communicate inside? Should we first communicate outside to the other stakeholders? All kinds of very, very complex questions to which there was no one answer. Then, how do we de-risk the fallout? What should be the communication that we make? It was so critical. I remember we spent so many times drafting, redrafting each one of the internal and the external communications. And all this was happening in the NRC. And finally, once the announcement is made, and there had to be a timeline, we had to debate, should we announce 1 year before, 6 months before, 3 months before, and each option had lots of pluses and minuses. And then what are the change management issues that will come up once the announcement is made and once the changes are taking place? And this change management is something that would last for at least a year beyond the date of the new man coming in. So I thought I'd just give you a flavor of the real life questions that we sort of engaged with over the course of 24 months. And that to me was a really powerful example and a story, if you like, to tell you that the NRC, in fact, is going to be a game-changing committee of the board because of the huge impact it has going forward. Now, if I can get on to the next slide, please. Mr. Arun Balakrishnan, I think, has actually said it all. And maybe a lot of what I'm saying is going to be a repetition. But I think it's really important to know that while the NRC directly is involved with the choice of people in the board and at the top level of management, actually the choice of those people results in certain behavior, results in a certain culture that is created, and it has to be totally linked with the purpose of the organization. It has to be rooted in the values of the organization. It has to be connected hugely with the strategy. And these things all put together create a business performance, which in turn either achieves or does not achieve the purpose of the organization. So I think it's really important to note that while the NRC is actively engaged in one part of an interconnected ecosystem, which is what I've called the people, culture, and behavior part, it has to be aligned with and it impacts all these other boxes and elliptical diagram that you see out here. So this was the setting of the context. And I could spend a lot of time on each of these, but since I have only about 20 minutes and then we have a Q&A, let me just move on to the next slide, please. That the NRC has to work very, very closely with the other committees of the board, with the board as a whole, and with the operating management. And it is very important that the NRC and the NRC committee members should know what their primary task is. What is the primary task and goal and objectives of the NRC, and make sure that we don't do things that other people are supposed to be doing or duplicate or leave out gaps. So it's very important to see the NRC as a part of an interconnected whole. And the first two slides actually was showing the relationship between the NRC and other parts, which were either boards and people or processes. And I think this must be kept in mind, that the NRC is operating at, I think, a very, very important inflection point of this ecosystem, this dynamic ecosystem. So let me move on now to the next slide, please. And this I'm not going to spend much time on. I think Arun has talked about it. Most of you would be quite familiar. What is important is first, of course, defining criteria, defining process, defining evaluation criteria, metrics, and then actually putting these definitions into use, bringing life to them. So it's not only about defining a selection process, but you actually get involved in the selection of independent directors, in the selection of incoming top management. You also very powerfully influence what kind of people come in and how they behave through the performance evaluation criteria and the incentivization. This is very, very important. What is rewarded and what is not rewarded can make a huge, huge difference to the way in which behavior and culture is shaped. And the NRC has a critical role to play. And of course, I've already talked about succession planning through the first example that I gave. So can we move on to the next slide, which I'll go through very fast, because this was the role of the NRC with respect to the top management that I showed you. And this is now with respect to board directors, which is very similar, except that it has one point which was not there earlier, which is the composition of the board. You see, the board, just having very powerful board members is not good enough. It's the whole board. That has to be powerful. So there has to be a relationship, there has to be a mix of skills that have to be there. And that mix of skills actually changes, given strategy, given purpose, given the state of the competition, given what are the real drivers of change and of competition, the composition of boards may change. So may, formulation of criteria. So may the evaluation process. And of course, the succession planning for the board is another very important part. And unfortunately, another important part, and I hope that is not used very often, is recommending to the board if any senior people have to be removed, or heaven forbid, if inside the board itself you reach a situation where you may sort of have to, in some ways, nudge some board director out. So that is the not so pleasant part of an NRC's duty, and I hope most NRC directors in their tenure don't have to deal with it, because it can become quite difficult. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Right, now this one, I have explained the main duties, right? The thrust, the strategic importance of the duties and functions. But in addition to that, there could be various other things that the Companies Act and SEBI keeps on coming up with, from time to time, which may not have been covered in the 2 slides that I showed you. And they also have to be covered willy-nilly by the NRC. Now, this is not my area of expertise. I must confess that on the boards that I have served, we would depend heavily on some board members who had this expertise, or on the company secretary, or on the legal director. This certainly is not an area of my expertise. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, and please don't ask me questions on this particular one. Maybe you can direct them to Mr. Arun Balakrishnan and other experts who are here. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, this one I want to spend a little time on. And I am actually in this slide talking about things that have in some sense been covered, but in some sense have not been covered. And they have to do with the view that NRC and its members take. So I think that they should be focused on unleashing the potential of people and systems to achieve the organizational purpose. That should really be the driving goal. And anything that they do has to ultimately be guided by how do we unleash the potential of people and systems to achieve the organizational purpose. The second thing is that this committee should have the ability to definitely be very, very strategic and purpose-driven on the one hand, and at the same time, they have to be making sure that what is needed transactionally in the short run is also done. So it's both short-term and long-term, and that's what I meant by one eye on the next step and one eye on the horizon. Then I think it's very important to choose members who, in addition to their skill and expertise, have humility, so that they respect the views of others, so that they are very good listeners. Because the kind of knowledge and the kind of situations that NRC has to deal with, if people there come across as being arrogant and telling others what to do, that will make it very, very difficult to do well the job that they are doing. Then I think the people on the NRC should be people who avoid coming to hasty conclusions. It's not about being a 6-gun Murugan here. You have to ask the right questions. You have to mull over it. You have to look at various options, hear often very, very conflicting views on the same subject, and then you have to come to a conclusion. And so I would say that it's very important not to have people here who are obsessed with the need to show I have all the answers, or that I can really come to a quick decision. Sometimes you have to come to a quick decision. I'm not saying that. But if most of the decision making is hasty, I think the NRC will create problems, because it is essentially a very long-term strategic body, which by the choice of people and processes and metrics is going to have a profound influence on the culture and the behavior and therefore the performance. Then I think you need people who have the ability to use the whole, what I call the whole mind, where you of course need intellect and logic, but you have to combine that with empathy and intuition and the ability to connect the main dots. Let me go to that trust at the end, but certainly the dynamics in the committee is very, very important, and so is the dynamics in the board and in any other committee. But in this committee particularly, because of the very sensitive and people oriented questions where there are egos, where people will feel hurt, everybody cannot make it, they have to have a very cohesive and synergistic dynamics in the committee, and yet have the possibility of disagreeing, of expressing, of challenging each other's views, but doing it with respect. So that's what I meant by cohesive and synergistic. Synergistic is, using the skills that are there and not wanting to impose your own views. And this, of course, would apply to any committee and to the board as a whole, but particularly in the NRC. Last but not least, trust is a key word for all leaders, for the board, but certainly for the NRC. The NRC should be trusted, and the NRC should generate trust by authenticity. And for me, authenticity means I speak what I think and I do what I say. Right? So thinking, saying, and doing are aligned again and again and again. And that is what generates trust. And I believe that above all, the NRC and its members should conduct themselves in a way that they actually walk the talk, the values, the culture that the organization has. And it's only then that they will generate trust and they'll be able to do their job well. Can we come to the next slide, please? The most important slide. Oh, no. So what should the NRC not do? Now, I don't have any specific answer, but I think in any sort of Socratic dialogue, it is important to know what we should do. And I think it's also very important to know what we should not do. And I referred to this somewhere, and I'll just leave this as a question. And if somebody wants to pick up on it, maybe we can have a dialogue today or some other day. But clearly, the NRC should, I would go back to the first two slides. So the NRC should not do anything that violates purpose or strategy or the values and such like. So that interconnected ecosystem in the first slide, the NRC should not violate any of them. And at a practical level, the second slide, where the NRC should not be in conflict with or duplicate or leave out things that the others are depending on the NRC for, with respect to the board, with respect to the other committees of the board, and of course, with respect to the top management. So I thought I'd just leave this. There are another 3 or 4 minutes, or maybe there is about 8 or 9 minutes left for the Q&A. But before that, let me come to the most important slide in my presentation. Next, please. Thank you very much for listening to me. So that's the end of my brief presentation on my experience over the last, maybe 20 years serving on boards and on NRCs. It was not a theoretical presentation, came straight from my experience. And now I'm very happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, sir, for your words of wisdom on what the NRC can be and how it can be the change engine for the organization. So nice of you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now open to the question answer session. Mr. J.S. Sundaresan will review the questions posted in the chat box to both the keynote speakers as well as other speakers, and I'll request him to elicit their reply. Mr. Sundaresan, popularly known as the Compliance Guru, is a well-acclaimed speaker on various aspects of Companies Act and SEBI LODR. Since inception, he is one of the key faculties of IOD training programs. Over to Mr. J.S. Sundaresan, please.
Thank you, Brigadier Kapoor, and thank you for that insight, Mr. Dube. There's so many questions actually. So let me start with Sardul's question. What is Mahindra's learning with respect to internal, external candidates? Yeah.
So definitely we chose that to go with an internal candidate. But this internal candidate, in all truth, came into the group 6 years ago, right? So we would normally prefer a homegrown person, but we are also open to bringing in people usually not at the top of the group itself. Large numbers of individual companies have CEOs who have come in as CEOs from the outside, because a lot of these companies are in new generation businesses as far as the Mahindra group is concerned. And we didn't have the skills and the mindsets and experience that we were looking for. But for the group as a whole, the conscious decision was taken that we would go with a person who's been inside, who knows the culture, who knows the values, who knows the people, who knows the problems, who can work with people, who will uphold our values, who will generate trust. And we don't want to take a risk with an outside person. So that was the final view that they took. But as I said, there are enough cases with individual companies where people have come in straight as a CEO from outside, because partly because we were growing so fast. In the last 20 years, the size and the face of the Mahindra Group has changed almost beyond definition. But I would say that this is a question different people have different views, but I think the research has shown generally that the probability of success for a rank outsider is rather low. I mean, it's definitely below 50%. I don't know what the exact figure is, but sometimes you need somebody from outside. But I told you what the Mahindra view was at the group level.
Yeah. So there is a question which actually complements it, which is from Dr. Rao, which is how much of culture fit of a person is considered for board position besides competency and merit?
Yeah. Okay. So now culture fit is very important, but it doesn't mean that we want yes men or we want people who will agree with each other. In fact, we don't want that. We want people at the board who have independent views, who can challenge each other, but do it respectfully. But we don't want toxic people in the board either. People who, do not allow the board to function, or who, make it difficult for the others. So if one can distinguish between toxicity and being a yes man, then I would say culture is important. But what is culture? Culture is the way people behave in the context of purpose, in the context of values. And as long as some inherent things are present, we like different kinds of people. We like diversity.
Thank you.
So now, I don't know whether I have answered the question or said so many things that it's as good as not answering.
No, again, the culture is a debatable thing and toxic is a debatable thing, because we have seen influences.
Of course. So is life a debatable thing, right?
So that's why I did not go on to probe regarding that. Oh, yeah. If it succeeds, it succeeds. So, I mean.
You're absolutely right. It is, there are 100 definitions of toxic, 100 definitions of culture, 100 views. And, my own experience is that anybody could be right. Who knows? It's all about choices. And that is the role of leadership, to make choices where more than one option is available.
I know.
But it's a very important choice. It's a very important choice, and it can succeed or it cannot succeed. But I think there is an important distinction to be made between having people aligned with culture and having yes men. That's important. So we do want people who are independent. Definitely we want people who are independent, who are not afraid to express their views, who are not afraid to challenge. Right? But we do want to avoid what could be called toxic, and I wouldn't know how to define toxic, but I mean, all of us have some idea of what toxic means.
Yeah, if I can pick one more question from what you said, internal over external. Yeah. Now, internal, when you choose somebody, how long is the process?
How long is the process?
In the sense, when should that whole process of inducting the incumbent should be? 5 years, 3 years?
Oh, if you mean to say how many years before that person takes over the CEO's role should he be told that he's going to be the CEO? In this case, we said about a year and a half. But there also there's a lot of balancing to be done. That if you announce very early, then there are problems that may get created for the current incumbents, or there may be turf issues. So these were the things that we debated, and we finally settled for a year and a half.
From that, if it is an external person that you want to recruit, then what happens? How long do you wait and for that person to settle down? And
yeah. So again, since we did not go for an external person in this case, I would have to then scratch my head and think of some other example in some other company in the Mahindra group. But as I said, generally we would like at least some, 6 months kind of a thing, but it depends. It depends upon the candidate. It depends upon the situation of the company. But, we would not like somebody to come in with no overlap at all with the person before. We do like handing over. We do like an induction. We do like people to come in. You can ask Mr. Kavinder Singh. He came in.
I'll reserve that question for him.
So, you can ask him. He'll tell you.
Okay. So Shalini, I think, has a question which is, why hasn't the NRC evolved as strongly as CHRO role has evolved in the last 2 decades?
Well, Shalini, I really don't know why that is not so. It has to do with how the NRC's role is defined, what kind of people come on the NRC and what they do on the NRC. But at least theoretically, it has a really important role to play. And why theoretically? That has been my experience, that, in the group, in the Mahindra group, at the group level, we pay a huge amount of importance to which group nominees get on to the NRCs of group companies. It's very, 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 very crucial from many points of view, including obviously to make sure that we get the right people, but also to make sure that we don't get the wrong people and then have what could be called a toxic effect, or to keep them aligned to the values and the culture of the group, while allowing them to have their own independence. So I would say that it's very important. Why has it not assumed? Well, I guess there is a time in life for everything. And my own feeling is that in the years to come, the role of people and how much of a differentiator they would be in creating a competitive advantage will become much higher relative to capital and technology. I think the age of praying at the altar of capital is now becoming less. It will never go away, but there was a time when capital was everything, right? Technology, of course, is really, really important, but it's how people use the combination of technology and capital that really makes the difference to what is produced. So my own feeling is, and my own prediction is, that in the years to come, the NRC and the role of people is going to become more and more acknowledged at the board level and in the organization itself. This is just my feeling.
Yeah. I will pick one more question, which could be the last question. This is again the Mahindra perspective on diversity of youth and technology on the board.
It's not right for me to talk.
If it's a difficult question, you can say pause.
Because I have retired. You see, so I can only tell you what my perception was, because I've retired now. It's not right for me to say what the Mahindra, but we think that both youth and technology are really game changers, very, very important, and they should be represented. Definitely technology has to be represented. Technology will become like electricity, it has to be used everywhere, but how you use it, what you use it for, and why you use it, that's really critical, and that's where the board members, and therefore we definitely would like people with the relevant technology and the mindset to be on boards. And I'm sure that we would like youth also, but now what is the definition of youth, and youth at whose expense? I really don't know, but I would say both are important, and both will find, in my view, a place on the board in Mahindra companies in the years to come.
Okay. Before I say thanks, one rapid fire. Succession planning, is it an accident or an incident?
It should be, it shouldn't even be either an incident or an accident. It should be a well-defined process.
Okay. Thank you so much. Over to you, Brigadier Kapoor.
So thank you very much for such a invigorating talk you had given and made us knowledgeable as far as the complete audience is concerned. And we really appreciate, in spite of so many constraints, you took out time and did the needful. Thank you very, very much, sir.
Thank you. I'll try and stay on for a short while more, but my apologies.
Most welcome, sir. Most welcome, sir.
Okay.
Most welcome.
Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the next speaker. That is Mr. Kavinder Singh, the Managing Director and CEO of Mahindra Holidays and Resorts, India Limited. Mr. Kavinder is a result-oriented professional with over 3 decades of illustrious and comprehensive experience in consumer sector. That is FMCG, paints, and adhesive, having worked in market-leading companies such as Asian Paints, ITC Limited, and Pidilite. He joined the Mahindra Group in 2014 as Managing Director and CEO. And in April 2015, he was given additional responsibilities as President, Leisure and Hospitality Sector, and member of Group Executive Board. Later in April 2019, he was appointed as Vice Chairman of Holiday Club Resorts of Finland. After graduating in Mechanical Engineering from NIT Warangal, he did the Advanced Manufacturing Management program from Harvard Business School, USA. He also did courses in General Management and Advanced Marketing Management from Wharton Business School, USA. Without wasting much time, may I now call upon Mr. Kavinder Singh to speak on the expectations of management from NRC. Over to Mr. Kavinder Singh, please.
Good evening. I will just start my presentation myself. Just give me a second. Right, is my presentation visible to all of you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very much.
All right. Just a quick, background about myself. Of course, thank you, Rajeev, for introducing me. But I wanted to make a important distinction that when I was given this topic by IOD, courtesy Mr. Rajeev Dube, I started to think a little bit about my background and how I have seen across my career, the functioning of the boards. I have primarily spent time in manufacturing businesses, and Mahindra Holidays is my first service business. And of course, it's a service business also with a difference, but I'm not going to talk about Mahindra Holidays today. And when I started to think about it, my eyes stopped here. And this is my favorite quote of 2021. I would love to read it because, I have been thinking about it for a long, long time. And when I look at the performance of the companies across, whether it is in India or abroad, I think choosing the wrong people to lead an organization is the #1 risk for businesses. And obviously coming from Warren Buffett, I think we should all agree to that. I at least fully believe in it. I also believe that quality of management is the single biggest differentiator. And therefore, when you look at market cap, which is a very standard way of looking at how companies are doing, and when you talk to all the investors and, like Mr. Dube, I have also had the fortune of, dealing with investors. And, they are constantly looking at what you're saying. And like Mr. Dube was talking about authenticity, are you consistent in what you're saying? Are you really focused on execution? And most importantly, we have seen that the real gains come when, of course, you have a good quality business added with quality of management. That becomes the single biggest reason for investors to actually put money. And that is what determines the market capitalization. I think the reason I'm trying to spend some time here, because when I think about NRC, and I'm going to move into a slightly, I have 2-3 slides which are a little dull, because the reason I'm saying they're dull is because they define the role of NRC in the statutes. And I did a bit of research on by talking to a few people, and I also went through some information on securities exchange control of US as to how the NRCs have evolved over a period of time. And then I will connect back to the expectations from the NRC. Being on the other side, I have never been on any NRC. I am the recipient of services of NRC, and I am at the beck and call of NRC in my role as Managing Director and CEO of my business. If I were to, look at the, composition, the way it has been specified, and I can understand the spirit behind that is that, at least 50% of the NRC constituents have to be independent. But if you look at UK, nomination committees composition, they actually want majority in non-executive directors. They believe that if you really want, you should think about having majority as non-executive directors, and non-executive independent directors. So independent directors, which are non-executive, of course, but 50%. But in the case of UK, they think about independent directors in majority in the NRC. Obviously, there is a desire to see that there is oversight of the board and management in some manner, and that is probably the intent there. Of course, the chairman of the board can be appointed as a member of the NRC, but shall not chair such committees. I think that's there in India, and it is also there in the international practices that I have seen. I think in the Indian context, if you really look at it, the focus is on the board. The role of NRC seems to be overtly focused on the composition of the board, criteria for determining the qualifications, performance evaluation, independence of the director. The focus seems to be from investors' point of view. This is what I see, that the NRC is actually performing in some manner a role, to safeguard the investor interest. And that I see as the theme behind the role definition. However, there is one, a clause, which is the second, point which I'm making here. It is very simply mentioned that recommend to the board a policy relating to the remuneration of the directors, KMPs, and senior management, period. That's it. And then I'm quite intrigued by this devising a policy on board diversity. As I studied further, I realized that NRC has a very, very important role in creating not only just the gender diversity in the board, but also to see whether the skills and competencies that are required to run the board are, sufficiently represented. I think this is a very important point on the board diversity. I will come to it as I move forward. I'm on the slide, which is now, talking about the international context. In the case of international context, it's even more clearer that the NRC, or nomination committee as they call it, they have, I think, a separate remuneration committee. So therefore, I picked on the nomination committee because for me that was of interest. Remuneration was only focused on compensation, which is fine, which is what I noticed. That is why in India we call nomination and remuneration. At least in US, there are separate committees between nomination and remuneration in the bracket compensation committee. So the remuneration compensation committee is all focused on compensation. And so that let me then therefore focus on the nomination committee. Here again, I find that the focus is on the board, whether it is the size, whether it is the composition. But there is one very interesting point here, which is point number 5. They're expecting nomination committee to develop clarity over the company's long-term strategy and make board recruitment decisions based on the needs of the company over several different time horizons. I'm not sure whether in the NRCs in India, we see this role playing out, and that's something that I found very interesting. And when I look around, in these 6 points, it is very, very clear again that the focus is on directors, which is rightfully so, and the directors' competence, diversity, training, orientation, getting the right skills, expertise, because there is obviously an underlying belief that NRC is empowered to choose the right skill set, directors with the right skill set, and actually create a board which is, meeting the requirements from all regulatory norms. Because as you know, this whole thing is regulated, whether it is SEC, whether it is SEBI, whether it is Companies Act. The focus seems to be on protecting investor interests, is my view, after reading the roles and responsibility. And therefore, I thought the idea of this today's webinar or conference to think about what does management expect from NRC. I thought that was very interesting. And Mr. Dube, who is my guide, mentor, obviously has covered quite a lot of ground. But here is a view from management, representing management. I thought I will make some recommendations, and these are my recommendations. And my recommendations are more in the nature of things that can be added to the role of NRC. Nothing needs to be obviously deleted. And I found that there are some companies who are actually doing this. And I'm not naming them, but in India, there are some companies who are looking at some of these things, not fully. There is not one company which does it in total. But as I was going through, I realized that there is an opportunity from my own experience. And this is purely my view, having been at the, as I mentioned, at the beck and call of NRC for the last 6-7 years in my current role. I would begin by saying that NRC is the custodian of culture. While it is important for them to look after the regulatory and the investor interests, but really speaking, the NRC should, in my view, can make a big difference in creating a culture of high trust, which Mr. Dube also alluded to. By the way, we haven't shared our presentations with each other, so if there are similarities, they are purely coincidental and probably come from the fact that we work in the same culture. So my belief personally is that the high trust and high performance, demanding high performance, expecting high performance is a role which NRC cannot perform, but they need to enable. Therefore, my word is very, very carefully chosen. They must enable the top management to create a culture of high trust and high performance. And I've tried to actually, make it operational as to how would they do that. If I was in NRC and if I was tasked with this, how would I do it? I would probably look at the key people metrics. Now, these are very, very basic metrics of employee engagement satisfaction scores. I can go on and on, whether it is employee as promoter score, whether it is various other rankings that come from the independent. I've just kept that as a more a placeholder. Key people metrics, whichever way you define, can we as NRC look at whether there is improvement happening here, because they are in some measure reflecting the culture that is being, let's say, propagated. I would say that the next part, because the first part is more about, how do you think about the culture with respect to the people, how they feel about working in the company, are they motivated, are they really, and this is where I think the question that Shalini made, that, asked was that, why is it that the NRC's role has not really evolved the way the CHRO's role has evolved? And this is where, in my opinion, is a bit of an answer there. I think NRC needs to evolve and look at some of these things and enable the management, because, as a managing director of a company, when I take decisions, sometimes I'm wondering really who's behind me. If certain decisions go wrong, or even if there is an improvement, will there be some level of appreciation that beyond the short-term performance goals, beyond the short-term performance goals, is there someone watching that there is the underlying metrics which are also improving? And I've often found that, that's not something that, at least today, NRCs look at. Focusing on short-term performance is very, very evident. And today, in Mahindra Group, and I think in many other companies that you work in or have worked, focus on the balanced scorecard methodology. There is a long-term, let's say, performance goals, but to be honest, I think most of the companies are still focused on yearly performance, not looking at the milestones over the next 3 to 5 years. While there is always a 3-year, 5-year business plan, but in some manner, I would say that NRC could also engage in seeing whether the directionally is the management moving in the right direction. And this is a great opportunity for them to enable, to support, to encourage, to keep moving towards the long-term direction, even if there are short-term, let's say, compromises have to be made, whether it is in terms of increasing people cost because you're hiring great talent for the future, or whether you are taking some bets which may not pan out. That kind of support, I think, is something that as a manager or as a managing director, I expect from NRC. If I were to move to my second point, which is about reward and recognition, and that is where the remuneration part comes in. But I would say it's not just about remuneration, it's also about recognition, structures, and every company has their own intangible recognition structures. But I strongly believe that there's a lot that can be done, particularly in service organizations. I've seen there's a lot of focus on PVH methodology, pride, values, and honor, which is the methodology that armed forces use to create a very strong bonding, which is what we also try to do in Mahindra Holidays. And we try to create a strong passion for customer service, etc. Then how do you recognize? I think NRC has a role to enable the management, because it again in some manner shapes the culture that the focus is not only on achieving short-term goals, but also on the long-term capability that you are building towards achieving the performance goals. And again, the same question. And if you are going to implement point number 2, how would you really go about doing it? Definitely look at the compensation structures, look at the recognition methodologies, look at benchmarking of talent, and ensure that the management is enabled to look at these things and not gloss them over. To my mind, these are very, very important parts of building the culture, because culture is not something which is fluffy, which people can't understand. Of course, it's a set of behaviors that you see people demonstrating in their day-to-day work. But at the end of the day, we do want a culture where there is high trust and high performance. This brings me to my almost the last slide. It is the last slide. If I were to look at, and I was quite intrigued by the theme, shaping the culture, people, and values. And therefore, I started to think about it, saying that, when I think about people and culture, high trust, high performance, these are in some manner output measures. What are the input measures? Does NRC get involved as to what goes behind the scenes? I do not want, obviously, NRC to become super CHRO. Please do not get that impression. If I'm giving that impression, my apologies. But I definitely believe that they have a role in engaging with the management to evolve future-ready org structure to achieve long-term goals, which is in line with the long-term direction and strategy of the organization, which means NRC should immerse themselves in whenever there is any strategy presentation being made. I think the chair of NRC should constantly think, are they future ready, or are they talking about some strategy for which they are not making investments right now, or they are not even looking at the talent? This, to my mind, would be a very interesting way of working with the operating management, as Mr. Dube also mentioned in his one of the slides, early slides. I would say that, yes, this is a role I think at least some of the NRCs I've noticed have started to do, enabling the top management to hire right quality talent with appropriate culture fit. I'm quite mindful that the NRC cannot possibly, independent directors cannot possibly, get into the nuance of the business when you are hiring a candidate. But there is a lot of, sensing on culture and the way even if it's a lunch or a chat or an interview, whatever way you want to structure it, informal interaction would be just about fine to understand whether the incumbent would be fitting in culturally. And there is a lot of focus on hiring the people with the right culture fit. The biggest difficulty here is, how do you define your culture? What are you looking for? That's something that becomes fuzzy. And this is where, again, NRC should enable the management to some extent define when we think of culture. I mean, if I were to talk about Mahindra Holidays as an example, the culture that we are trying to create, we have something called Seva, service with empathy, warmth, and attentiveness, something which Mr. Dube was championing for the entire group. But in Mahindra Holidays, we have further gone and actually defined 6 behaviors. And we look for these behaviors when we look at hiring people. And they have been put in a very simple manner, because they go right from the lowest, the frontline level to the highest level. And if I may just take 1 minute to highlight these behaviors. And the behaviors are, so simply described that I don't have to explain. So I will just reel out. The first behavior is can do, will do. A lot of people say that they can do it. Will they do it? We want to see that. Basically, focus on execution orientation. Second, going extra mile. Are you truly a gem? Will you go beyond your boundary of your department function, and will you do things which are required? The third one, and by the way, these are all created within us, and they are not picked up from definitely any book or any information outside. This is what we have seen over our experience. This is what we need for our business. The third one is respect for people. If you think about in a hospitality business, there are times when guests can be very, very tough to deal with. The constant thing that we teach our people is respect, irrespective of the person on the other side, however unreasonable the demand may be. And most importantly, not just respect your customers, but also respect your colleagues. Only then you can work in the culture that we want to sort of create. The fourth one is called creative restlessness. I mean, all of us are restless. Are you creatively restless, or are you just anxious? So we try to sort of expect our people to think on the feet sometimes and come out with creative solutions to the problems that may not have apparent solutions. The fifth one is actually very simple: working together. Can you work together to solve people problems, customer problems? Just work together. I mean, again, in some manner, it's about breaking the silos. Not easy to do. It's easy to say, but these are the behaviors we look for. And the last one is, do you really own what you do, or you are just taking it as an assignment? And to my mind, this is extremely important, because in our business, we believe there's a lot of need for eye for detail. So can you sort of own? Why am I saying these 6 behaviors connected to? Because I'm defining my culture. I believe that the culture has been defined. Service with empathy, warmth, and attentiveness requires these 6 behaviors, right from frontliner to the top management, and everybody has to walk the talk. And this is something that if our NRC directors know, and of course they know in our case, they can easily see when they are talking with a candidate, whether at least 1 or 2 or 3 behaviors are evident, at least through a conversation. If not, obviously, and of course, ref check is a separate thing, but I'm just talking about an independent view of a candidate, because there is always a pressure in operating management to fill up the position because the work gets impacted. So can we somehow see that the culture fit is in some manner tested enabled by the NRC? And I'm bringing to my last point: reinforce the culture and values through monitoring of compliances, whether it is code of conduct, ethics, various policies, that value system that has been defined. Can it be reinforced through some kind of milestone metrics that management shares with the NRC, so that there is an integrated way of moving around these things? To my mind, this is how I would like to come to an end. And I think I have done, I don't know whether I've done all right on time, but I think this is where I end. So just the last 2 slides are my key recommendations. Thank you very much for patient listening.
Thank you, sir. And over to Mr. Sundaresan, please.
Thanks, Kavinder. And then let me straight away come to the question. This is by Ramesh. What would be typical qualification and experience of a NRC member? Is there any qualification that you think? And that actually tops up with Anil's thing saying, should a member have PR skills?
I think this is a question a little bit beyond my pay grade, if I were to say, because I'm not the one who selects NRC. But I think what I look for, I can definitely mention. When I look at the NRC members, I definitely want them to be able to understand the business by virtue of being the members of the board, at least in 1 or 2 functional areas. So when I talk about diversity in the board, we are looking for people, at least in our business, someone who has worked in marketing, someone who has handle people at large scale, because people at scale is another skill that people learn when they handle larger organization. You don't get to learn that skill unless you have handled people at scale. So whether you have handled people at scale, marketing, and customer service, it's an extremely important area for us, whether it is in the resorts or whether it is in the. So if you have people of these kind of skills and who understand how much a reward and recognition can go in building an organization. If you think about Disney, how has Disney become what it has become? We know what is their secret sauce. It is the way they deal with their people, it's the way they recognize their people, it's the way they deal with customers. And every individual over there, okay, is designed to think like a customer. I know of a guy who joined as a chief financial officer in one of their companies, he had to act as a Mickey Mouse for 3 days in one of their parks. Okay, so he had to really understand how you really deal with the customers. And by the way, as a CFO, you would never want to be, you actually normally don't deal with enough customers, particularly in a B2C business. So here is my answer, that summary, that yes, you should have people with diverse skill sets who understand the business, because only then you can, satisfy some of the criteria that I was mentioning, which is in terms of creating the right culture and people and values, shaping the people and values, which is what the last 2 slides were.
So, question from Shalini: since you have been presenting to NRC and in a way reporting to the board, what is that one role NRC has played which has helped you and your business the most?
All right. One role which our NRC has played, which has helped me in the business, is whenever I have done hiring of the senior people in our company, I have definitely run past the 2 independent directors that we have on our board, and at least 1 non-independent, just to get a sense as to whether the culture fit, whether the domain expertise, I really don't expect NRC to check. I'm very clear about it. In fact, if they would get into the domain area, I would actually in some manner say that, hey, this is something that you should leave it to us, because we have done our bit there. I would expect them to look at number 1, of course, the culture fit, and most importantly, if they know someone whom this guy has worked, can they do a ref check for me? I found ref checks has been a big help, because whenever I've gone to an NRC board member and he has said, hey, I know this company, this guy has worked there, I can check out on this guy. I said, please do it. It's a great help, because I also been doing a lot of informal ref checks. Can you help me? So to my mind, these are the areas where I have found NRC quite helpful.
Okay. Taking a cue from there, I mean, with great difficulty, you identify a candidate and place before the NRC. NRC rejects it. How good or bad you feel?
I was expecting this question. I don't know why. I got this feeling that, have I bitten myself, too much, or have I gone too far? I think this has been a fear in my mind always, that if I'm sending a, selected candidate, in my opinion, he's selected. Okay, that's how he goes to the board. He doesn't go to the board unless he's selected by my team members and me. So here is the thing. The good news for me is that not a single candidate that has gone to NRC so far has been rejected by NRC. But I would be very disappointed. But I would take it, because I think, this is what I really want. Because to my mind, NRC is a disaster check in any case. Yeah. And if they are able to pick up something which we couldn't pick up, that's a great help, because people mistakes, they are extremely costly. You lose, at least my thumb rule is, you lose 2 years from the time you get the guy to you to the time you take a decision finally. If the person doesn't work out, it's 2 years is the average time in India, particularly at the leadership level, because you need to give time. So yeah.
Okay. Another question to you is, as a CEO, who communicates to you first about your succession planning, the promoter or the NRC? And how do you feel about it?
All right. So in our case, we have a very interesting model about succession planning, because I'm a part of Mahindra Group. And so we have an Apex Talent Committee. Apex Talent Committee is headed by Anand and a few, Mr. Dube was a part of Apex Talent Committee, by the way. So I, once a year, sit with the Apex Talent Committee and share the status of every leader, not just the performance, but also the traits and the issues, if any, emerging about the person, good, bad, ugly, whatever. It's a very candid discussion. And this is where, I try to align with the, let's say the group chairman and the group HR head. And this is where we begin to think and form views of the people. This is one of the most important interventions that happens at Mahindra Group. When it comes to my own succession, the real discussion again happens in the Apex Talent Committee, where I am candidly asked that who could be my successor, because in fact, I cannot enter the committee unless I have defined my successor. So my successor, in my eyes, is always presented before the Apex Talent Committee. Yeah, it could change. It need not be the same person over the years, but definitely that's something that is discussed in that committee. And that's one hour that we spend in a year is probably the most, let's say, valuable hour. And again, a similar level of activity we do with our NRC when the performance appraisals and the long-term incentives have to be paid out. I present in front of NRC the entire senior management team, how they have performed, how I see people, and how they think. Yes, with NRC doesn't ask me my succession. I think they do discuss behind closed doors, which I'm not aware of.
No, that's a very diplomatic answer. Okay, if that is the case, what runs in your mind? Rapid fire, guilt or fear?
So as far as I'm concerned, neither I'm guilty nor I'm fearful. You know why? Because the authenticity that Mr. Dube was talking about, if you are thinking what you are saying, or rather, you say what you think and you do, what you say, I think you don't have to fear anyone. And I don't think you have to be guilty because you're not doing anything wrong ever anyway.
Perfect. I think, amazing. Yeah. And one question that I want to pick from Arun's address, actually, this is regarding your take on employee wellness and mental health, which is going to be the biggest challenge in the times to come. How are you going to take it to the NRC?
Okay. Here is something that I did about 3 months ago. In one of the meetings with NRC, this issue was discussed, that how are we thinking about, assisting our, team members, families as well as themselves. So before this issue could even come up to NRC's, let's say, some kind of a discussion in one of those discussions. In fact, I was, of course, being closer to the people. We do a lot of town hall, we do a lot of communication exercises. I was picking this issue up. I actually presented to NRC. I said, listen, I'm going to start a helpline, a mental health related helpline, where you can actually raise any issue. It could be work related. It will be pure 100% anonymous. I found out in a set of people who are doing brilliant work on this, and I trusted them. And I said, listen, go ahead. We are not worried. Whatever comes out of it, anyway, this is anonymous, but we would like to know the patterns. The good news is that NRC immediately supported it. They didn't even ask me how much it's going to cost. I also didn't tell them how much it's going to cost, because if they don't ask, why do I tell? I anyway am responsible for my team. So I went ahead and did it. I just actually informed them. And the good part is that there is a good pickup. In the beginning, I was worried that good pickup means what? That people are having a lot of issues. But then the issues are coming to surface. That's the good part of it. And once they come to surface, I'm sure they get dealt with. That's the whole idea behind it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. In fact, if I had you for more time, I would have kept on asking you questions. Rapid fire, last question. Remuneration for you, is it given or taken?
So as far as I'm concerned, remuneration is, my view, fundamental view is that whatever remuneration is given, or I don't want to answer the given or taken part, but my answer is that as far as I am concerned, the value that I bring on the table has to be assessed by the NRC, and whatever value is seen by the NRC and my remuneration is fixed according, I'm perfectly fine with it. Reason? Because I definitely believe that there is definitely some wisdom out there which is able to understand what people like me are bringing to the table and how they should be valued. And I also understand that NRC, particularly in our case, is quite mindful and aware that the number one has to be obviously super motivated to be able to create, motivation ripples down the line. So I think they are extremely fair. They understand what's the market value of the individual. And to that extent, that is how I have been remunerated right from the time I joined.
Thank you so much, Kavinder. Thank you. Over to you, Brigadier Kapoor.
Right. Thank you very much, sir, and for elucidating the subject so beautifully. Your perspective has never been, though you have never been part of NRC, but laying the focus on the culture and values in the system and employees is really exemplary. Thank you very, very much, sir. Really appreciate the talk. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now moving on to the biography. The next, can you just move on? Ladies and gentlemen, now we move on to the next chapter, that is the biography of Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, which will be deliberated by Mr. Prasanna. Mr. Prasanna is an experienced legal professional with 3 decades of experience. Currently, he is an independent director, independent corporate, law consultant and arbitrator with various institutions, including the Singapore International Arbitration Center. In the next 10 minutes or so, Mr. Prasanna shall be presenting a synopsis of the biography of Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, former Chief Justice of India and National Chairman of Institute of Directors. The book titled The Man and the Judge, written by Mr. V. Sudesh Pai. This is IOD Bangalore's tribute to this great human being and remarkable intellectual. Over to Mr. Prasanna, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a very big burden on my shoulder to be able to present to you the man and the judge, Justice Venkatachalaya. He has been a beacon of wisdom, and he is our guiding force, and he has provided the kind of insight, the kind of wisdom that IOD can immensely benefit from. The Man and the Judge is a biography which is penned by Mr. V. Sudesh Pai, an advocate. He's a distinguished lawyer and also a legal philosopher, and he has been the visiting professor to a number of legal institutions. And he has indeed done a great job in actually putting together the kind of thoughts, the kind of experiences that Justice Venkatachalaya actually lived through all his life. Ladies and gentlemen, the man you see on the cover of this book is not a man or not just a judge. He is an institution. He is today 91 years old. And if you asked him what he did 50 years back, or what kind of reasoning he gave in one of the judgments, you'll be astonished at the remarkable memory that he has in recollecting and telling you exactly what happened. If I may just give a few insights. It is given to very few by destiny that the virtues are equal to their genius, and their character is distinguished not by few admirable prominences, but is uniformly elevated. Justice Venkatachalaya belongs to that exceptional class, a man of law of a select band, an erudite scholar, and a saintly person. He is one of our most illustrious and revered judges. He is among the few who have occupied the highest position without being touched by the pomp and paraphernalia of office, and without compromising the highest standards of integrity and independence. The book, Man and the Judge, presents the journey and evolution of the man who became a revered judge, whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. The book contains fairly comprehensive biographical sketch of Justice Venkatachalaya and editorial notes on almost all of his reported judgments in the Supreme Court and the High Court, besides some of his speeches and writings. The judgments are masterpieces of judicial exposition. To study his life and work is to share in a rich an awesome heritage which will benefit both the lawyer and the layman. The book is an admirable, timely reminder of the great values that his life and work represent and his abiding influence on our lives and thinking. Justice Sharad Bobde, Chief Justice Sharad Bobde, who recently remitted office, he was at the release function of this book. And this is what Justice Sharad Bobde had to say. I am certain that this book will impart the most important lesson of protecting democratic values, which is the collective conscience of civil society. It is commendable how Sri Sudesh Pai has aptly covered all aspects of Justice Venkatachalaya and the career of the splendid and magnanimous day. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may just take a couple of more minutes, I would like to say that many people have paid tributes to Justice Venkatachalaya and his legal acumen. I would like to say one thing, what Justice Krishna Iyer, the noted jurist, had to say in 1993 about Justice Venkatachalaya, both as a judge and a man. He said, Venkatachalaya is widely read and inclined to listen, a difficult art for the brethren who assume from the bench all the wisdom and the law of most of which they are innocent. Integrity is Venkat's forte, humility his second nature, and piety his morning's first charge. I hope Venkatachalaya, on retirement from high office, will graduate into a profound student, non-stop pursuit of learning, nor get lost in the pursuit of patronage, hoping for retiral reincarnation, as many of the robed brethren do these days, diminishing the glow of the great judicial profession. Not to sell one's soul for a mess of pottage is a hard resolve, harder to fulfill, to strive for justice without wearing the authoritarian robe is the measure of a judge's moral fiber. It has been rightly said, the man who graduates today and stops learning tomorrow is uneducated the day after. Alas, many of my robed brethren on ascent to the bench stop learning and prefer to remain uneducated in a higher sense. They are too busy to page through books beyond their dockets and a wider range of human interest beyond the limited needs of the cases to be heard or dismissed as of no concern. Proud of Mr. Venkatachalaya, I fancy, is among the exceptions who prove the rule. The judgments incidentally reflect the man, his passion, compassion, prejudice, and inner contradiction. In short, the social philosophy of the judge. The reported judgments of Justice Venkatachalaya reveal a breadth of outlook and gamut of jurisprudence which does credit to the judge. It is not calendrical seniority, nor memorized erudition, nor quotational profusion, nor interminable pages of tiresome prolixity that makes a competent brother on the Supreme Court bench. It is wider vision, values, commitment, creative imagination, penetrating perception of the paramount law, interacting with the Vistarama of changing social, economic, and political scenarios, and above all, a deep grounding in the many dimensions of jurisprudence and discipline of law, which is an anchorage of justice through law. Venkatachalaya's rulings cover a large range, reveal a courage and insight. Justice Venkatachalaya, of course, proved to be the exception that Justice Iyer spoke of. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the book, The Man and the Judge, for your reading. It is available at Ameya Law Agency, and I request you to please read this book. It is absolutely enthralling, and even for non-legal people, it is written so nicely that it will walk you through the kind of milestones that Justice Venkatacharya has crossed. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you this book, The Man and the Judge. Thank you for your patience. Over to Brigadier Rajeev Kapoor.
Thank you, Mr. Prasanna, for such a powerful and passionate talk, thereby giving a big tribute to the great human being. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen,
pleasure. Thank you.
We now move to the second session of the distinguished speakers who shall share their views on various roles of NRC, starting with Dr. Shalini Sarin. Her experience ranges from Chief People Officer to Head of CSR to business leads for the base of Pyramid Solar Lighting business. She has worked and gained valuable experience across India, Europe, and USA, and is currently on the Global Supervisory Board of Nagaro SE GmbH. She is an executive director of Electro Mobilitat, an EV charging startup, and is also on numerous boards as independent director. She has an impressive academic record, doctorate in organizational behavior, and master's in sociology and human resource management. She has also done advanced human resource program from Ross School of Business, University of Michigan, USA, and is also a qualified executive coach from Motorola University of Chicago. Without wasting much time, I now hand over to Dr. Sarin, Shalini Sarin. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay. So, we all are aware that, the role of the board is changing, and especially during the crisis, we've seen that, the board has been very concerned and the stakeholders are very concerned. What is the preparedness of the organization in responding to this COVID? And we also know that the previous board members were based on certain skills and certain competencies. And today the requirement may have changed a little bit. We've seen, and I want to quote here Larry Fink, who talks about the company, it does not seek the benefit from the full spectrum of human talent. And both Arun and Ravinder and Rajeev ji has shared the same examples, that unless we have the entire human talent, we will not be able to hire the best. We will not be able to reflect the needs of the customers and the communities, or even outperform the competitors. While today the sustainability report comes into the annual, sustainability scores are reflected in the annual report, we do not see the talent strategy reflected well enough in the annual report. And I think this is very important, and a very important comment that Larry Fink has made. And from their perspective, they talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but these intangibles become very, very important in the long term as well. Can we move next to the next slide? And on the next slide, essentially, I'm talking about how, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, in the next slide, I'm essentially talking about how important it is, that the experiences are aligned with the requirement of today. And we've, discussed this today, and I think this was a question raised in the previous discussion as well. What are the competencies and the skills required today? And while the competencies and the skills that are required, sorry, you've moved to the next slide. Can we still stay on the skills? Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And while many organizations are also considering that besides human resource management, labor and compliances, market trends and compensation, all of this may be important, but can we get some advisors on board for the interim to be able to bridge the gap for the skills that are required. So maybe today what is required is organization design, restructuring, public health, which becomes extremely important. And as the organization recovers from COVID aftershocks and supports the growth, there could be several unanticipated risks due to long COVID. And I think Arun alluded on this, the brain fogging. I remember having worked in the Netherlands, there was the state which was providing to the companies a mandate that if there is an employee who has suffered due to mental or physical disability, then for a period of 1 year to a little over a year, he would be given a sabbatical. And when he would come back from the sabbatical, the state would provide a psychologist along with the counseling of the manager and slowly, gradually start taking his responsibility. So I don't know whether we need to start thinking about what the mental health issues would be. Let's assume some of our top talents go through a setback during this long COVID crisis, if they have that impact, or the black fungus and the white fungus that we've been hearing about. What is the support and the rehabilitative care we can provide to prevent this downward spiral of personal health or even finances? So I think this is something that we really need to think about. And of course, NRC cannot be seen taking an easy option. And that's the reason I asked this question to the previous speaker. How many times have you recommended a candidate to the board, to the NRC, and the NRC has rejected? What role have you seen the NRC taking? Is it an active role or a passive role? And I think this is extremely important, that we have NRC with a sound judgment and courage and emotional intelligence, because it is not just the skills, but also the bandwidth of the NRC, which becomes very important. So let's move to the next slide. And here I want to talk about the role of NRC. And I think we all are very clear about the role of the board and the NRC, which is nose in and hands out. So that means we are not here to replace the CHRO, or we are not here to replace the CEO. And it is very important that the role of NRC is agreed and clarified. And like our previous speakers have been talking about, the culture, the values, succession, business performance, long-term strategy, these are the roles that have to be agreed and clarified. And every year, take stock of those roles, whether we are on the same page or not, or is the management or senior leadership team getting the right support. Today, of course, we are grappling with the service levels in the supply chain. Never before have I seen a supply chain leader sitting at the senior leadership. But today, during COVID days, supply chain has become extremely important. Can we mitigate some of these risks by collective or multi-layered decision making? How do we recalibrate the KPIs and the strategic goals? What are the opportunities going forward? Will we abandon growth on the basis of share price or ROIC? Are there new measures that are emerging? For example, ESG is becoming extremely important. And is it getting the right deserved attention? And we all know that businesses cannot thrive if employees, customers, communities aren't healthy. And if the society is fractured the way it is today, then the priorities that we look for are very different. So while REMCOM would approve, compensation, structure, and industry benchmarking, organization wage bill, and comparison vis-a-vis peers, executive plans, and stock options. Today, they are also faced with an added review whether the pay is fair, and if the business is down, then are we extending enough benefits? Are we also extending the medical and health coverage? And these are the issues that NRC can play a very significant role in guiding the senior leadership team. The next one is, of course, the ethics and compliance. And this is also becomes very important, that we've had several examples of sexual harassment, abuse, and we've been talking about the toxic culture and also retaliatory firings against those who speak out during scandals. And that's when the leadership has always been questioned. Studies show that firms with a stronger governance are less likely to have opportunistic managers. And that's what I guess is the culture. Not only does a good governance align the interest of managers and shareholders, but also results in better financial performance. Today, the board is in particular concerned about how companies are handling the crisis. What is the impact on their reputation? Is the culture toxic? Are we providing flexibility and agility? What is the new normal going to be? What are the new skills and which are the new geographies that we are going to hire from? Because work from home is becoming very prevalent. And in some of the boards that I sit on, we are already discussing that we want to reduce the office space. We want to open the offices in tier 2, tier 3 cities. We want to encourage work from home more so that they don't need to travel to the big cities. And, so all these are discussions which are going to impact the organization and the budgets and the culture and how we hire people, where we hire people. What kind of leaders does the organization need? How do we acquire diversity and inclusion, whether it is gender or generational diversity? What is the impact of COVID on our top talent? Does discussing talent once a year for 1 hour suffice with the NRC, or should we increase the periodicity, maybe have it twice a year or thrice if possible? What is the succession planning of KMP is becoming imperative today, because unfortunately we have lost a few KMPs in some of the organizations. We have maybe had many infected who might have a long-term impact. Many of them have had their families infected, who may have some urgent backfills due to death or separation. And last point here that you see, the 7th bullet that I've listed out is NRC only giving blessings on the hiring and the budget and key decisions, or is NRC also mentoring some of the KMPs? And I think it's a great opportunity for the NRC to extend itself and also review the new risk landscape and the lessons learned during pandemic. So I think this actually summarizes the role of NRC, which becomes very important. And we've been talking about it, but this needs to be clarified and communicated and agreed. As we move to the next slide, I want to just allude to the fact on the board composition and the role that NRC plays on the board composition. Again, like the audit chair, NRC chair also needs to exercise independence and not play a passive role on rubber stamping. And therefore, board nomination on diversity of skills, experience is extremely important. and ethnicity, etc. Next, board evaluation and what is the role that we play actively. Again, I re-emphasize the active role versus passive role of rubber stamping. And, are the directors sitting on too many boards? What is their attendance? What is their active participation and independence? And if they're reading their board papers in advance. And the other is on board retirement and succession. And many countries have mandated that the board should not sit for 2 terms, each term being 5 years. And there should be an active succession for the board. But who is discussing this? And are board members retiring at the age of 70? And are they preparing for the succession? What are the skills required for the organization in the future? I think these are all very, very important discussions and have a long-term impact on the performance of the organization. As we move to the next slide, the next slide is essentially talking about the impact. And we all are aware that while the Audit Committee has a shorter term horizon, which is it does have an impact immediately. A bad audit decision might be reflected in your annual performance, whereas a bad NRC decision might have an impact much later. So I think it's the time horizon which is extremely important. And unfortunately, many companies treat the board as a compliance framework rather than an ally to encourage differentiated performance. And an audit committee, of course, gained a lot of prominence through SEBI and the regulatory framework. So can the NRC also bring in an external ally? Is that something that would really help build the benchmarking and the credibility with maybe the Hewitt, Mercers, or CIIs or FICCIs or whoever could bring that external ally to the REMCOM. As we move next, and this alludes to the fact that the annual reports today started to report on ESG, and that's why companies are really very consciously reporting on their carbon footprint, net zero, waste management and landfills. All of that is now being reported very well. And the talent strategy, which has an impact on the culture and therefore gives the confidence to the investors on the robustness of the pipeline and how it impacts the business, is extremely important. And we should be very demanding as shareholders and board members as well. And that brings me to my next slide, which is essentially the last slide. And I think this is similar to what even Kavinder shared, and that is that we can actually, Kavinder, and this is something that says that we can actually add the EBITDA multiple through clear, credible vision, capability, and whatever capability the market needs, the right kind of talent, innovation capability, learning agility, suited to the organization needs. With that, I'd like to end my discussion. Happy to take questions.
Madam, question is in the end, after all the 3 speakers speak, we have kept it that way. Now, thank you very much, Dr. Shalini, for bringing out the challenges of COVID-19 and its impact on the performance of organization. We move on to the next speaker, Mr. H.N. Srinivas. Mr. Srinivas is an advisor with Tata Trust and has been a former Senior Vice President, HR of India Hotels Taj Group, an experienced consultant and advisor with demonstrated history of working in philanthropy of industrial house. He is a hardcore HR professional who is fully committed to industrial relations and HR functions. and is responsible for coordinating and building businesses and policy initiatives. During his tenure with Taj Group of Hotels for 27 years, he has also been instrumental in building teams, leaders, and making them grow. Currently, as advisor of Tata Trust, he is in a major skill development project to facilitate and support the vocational skill initiative and gainful employment across India. Over to Mr. Srinivas. Mr. Srinivas?
You can hear me now?
Yes, but we can't see you, sir.
You can't see me, okay.
Just put on the video, please.
Yes, you can see me?
Ravi, yes, we can see you, sir. We can see you.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor, for that introduction. And it is indeed a pleasure and privilege to be interacting with such senior leaders, and also the co-panelists and the people who spoke before me. A lot of very, very interesting points they've already covered, and some of the thoughts that are going through my mind, it looks as though they have read my mind and they have said many things which I wanted to say, but nevertheless, I will highlight and emphasize some of the important things that that people-related issues in organizations that should become a board mandate and an imperative for the boards to look at the kind of changes, to look at the kind of programs and systems and processes the companies are implementing, to look at the long-term sustainability of companies and building a high-performance work culture. Let me thank at the outset Mr. Arun Balakrishnan, who has put together a wonderful and most admirable program, and I was learning a lot listening to my earlier speakers, and it is a great opportunity to interact with all of you. And also I thank the IOD Bangalore chapter and people like Mr. Kapoor and others. As this subject was being discussed by Mr. Arun Balakrishnan a couple of months ago with me, I was curious to look at some of the formal definitions and the role, responsibility schedule or the guidelines which has been of NRC, which has been defined by several professional organizations. The one that struck me as interesting and very simple was the definition of NRC provided by Association of Chartered Accountants of India. They've given a very simple definition. The definition goes like this. The primary role of NRC is to assist the board of directors and the company in fulfilling its governance and supervisory responsibility relating to human resource management and compensation. That's how it goes. So this definition touches upon a range of important people-related issues. It touches upon leadership development, succession planning, a fair method of selecting and appropriately rewarding the best leaders, including directors on the board, through a well-defined total reward system. But in the last 15-20 years, several Indian organizations, as I have been witnessing in the Tata Group and also a few other non-Tata Group companies like Infosys, Wipro, Hindustan Unilever, while defining the role of NRC, have included issues of corporate governance, core values, performance-driven culture of diversity and inclusion, ethical conduct of leadership teams, standards of business conduct with respect to dealing with stakeholders, multiple stakeholders, and people management issues internally, and a larger responsibility of corporate governance, which is a fairly wide umbrella, which looks at ethical conduct of senior leaders and the business conduct and how company defines its relationship with multiple partners and stakeholders, customers and vendors, and even the government and employee, how do they address employee aspiration, customer needs, and shareholder demands, and vendor expectations. So what are some processes that have been set up and that have been managed in the organization to address these needs and respond to them creatively. In other words, there are multiple role systems, interest groups, which constitute an organization. Now, each one of them make a commitment of a resource, of their time, of their patronage. Customer commits his patronage. Employees commit their time, and shareholders commit their resources. So vendors commit quality products. For the commitment they make, they expect something very specific in return from the company. So in other words, there is a role of coordinating this, of integrating this. That is the expectations, needs and expectations. If each of these stakeholders should be woven into some kind of a tapestry of a company program, and the program has to be delivered effectively such that the relationships that the organization builds with each of these stakeholders are strong, are stable, and rewarding. Only then, when a company faces some external problems, I would say, you see, the external environment is hostile for whatever reason. It could be socio-political, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a pandemic like the one that we are experiencing currently. So how does a company respond to a crisis situation like that? If the relationships that have been built by the organization has been strong with all the stakeholders, they provide support, they provide encouragement, they stand by the company in a manner that the company comes out of this crisis, copes with the challenge successfully, and remains there up where they always belong. This brings me to the example of what happened during 26/11 terror attack in Taj Hotels. 4 misguided militants barged into the lobby at about 9:40 in the night and opened fire and started killing people indiscreetly. And we did not anticipate this. We didn't know what's going on. And mind you, within about half an hour, 40 minutes, the senior most leadership of the company arrived, and they were standing near the hotel. They were not allowed to get anywhere close to the hotel, though Mr. Ratan Tata and Mr. Krishna Kumar themselves wanted to push to get inside the hotel, but they were not permitted, fortunately, because the terrorists were inside. And the entire leadership team gathered there within 45 minutes to an hour. And the general manager of the hotel was outside. He managed to come back and get into the hotel and take charge of the ship that is in troubled waters. And all that we could do is to see this most painful and horrible spectacle of gunshot sounds and fire and smoke gushing out of windows in various floors, and feeling extremely disturbed, emotionally shaken up. After about 3 days of doing the standing there, we were at one stage, we were called to come inside the hotel then by the person who's commanding it, Commander Abhay Gupta. Lieutenant General Abhay Gupta was commanding this special protection group who handled this terror attack and the response to this terror. And he called us and he said, look here, we have killed all the terrorists and now we can come inside. When we got in, it was looking like a ravaged battlefield. And the entire media was there. Worldwide media, international media, domestic media, regional media. They were all standing there crying and shouting that Ratan Tata should make a standing statement. I remember this very distinctly because I was there in the team. We were all standing together. Ratan Tata comes out and he makes 2-3 statements. This speaks about the leadership. This speaks about the core values. This speaks about the commitment to the society and community in which the company operates. He said 3 things. One is, yes, they have hurt us, but they can't beat us down. Very soon, within 3-4 weeks, we are going to open the hotel and it's business as usual. And all employees, whoever has been there, on duty, even if he's a part-time casual employee, he will come back to the hotel and they will all be together and work will begin. Number 2, the terror attack has happened in about 10-12 centers in the city. That is in Boribandar, in Kama Hospital and Nariman House And the devastating attack was in Chhatrapati Shivaji Station and various other locations, Santa Cruz and all that. And he said, look here, I'm going to take up the relief and rehabilitation for all the terror victims in the city of Mumbai, for all terror victims. And I was asked to make a presentation within 1 week of this terror attack to the board. Our board was a heavy board with Mr. Dadi Seth, Mr. Deepak Parikh and Anuaga, and we had Jamshed Godrej and very, very senior people, industry leaders. All of them were insisting that we should listen to the programs and plans that Taj has to provide rehabilitation and relief to not only people who have lost their lives or been injured in the Taj Hotel, but also to in the city of Mumbai. So I don't know whether it is, there was no, NRC phrase, NRC committee. There was a remuneration committee that was headed by Mr. Dadi Seth. He would call me repeatedly to ask me what are some, programs we have already lined out. And the board took active interest. Every month, the board was asking me to do a presentation of how much of this implementation is working, what help and assistance would you require to ensure that this entire program is most successful and it reaches the people who are really suffering. Just giving you an example, and mind you, when the terror attack happened, there were 541 employees in the hotel. Not a single employee left the hotel, and all of them stayed back. Some employees who went out also came back and stayed on. And I received a number of letters from employees, from customers who were saved by some of these employees, praising and telling us how employees saved them from a almost sure and certain death. So I received about 200 letters, and the Hindustan Unilever, the Unilever Corporation worldwide were having a management conference and cocktail dinner in one of the halls. Leena Nair, who is on the board of Unilever Corporation, she was the head of HLL, and she was also there. And so, and there were many other functions and parties that were going on. And employees, the way they have come forward, demonstrated extraordinary courage to save, putting their own life at risk. It became a story, a legendary story. So much so the Harvard Business School team came down to India, and they wanted to understand, how do we build this commitment? What are the values that Taj employees practice? How do you inculcate these values among all employees? And what kind of recruitment you do? How do you reward them? How are they so customer-centric? Somebody saying that I would like to give up my life and save the customer is something extraordinary. So this is an example of how, if you address certain long-term issues of building culture, a performance-driven culture, institutionalize ethical values, human values in an organization, what kind of results you can expect when there is a crisis for the company. When I was looking at the role of NRC and the boards in addressing people-centric issues, I came across two very interesting research studies that was carried out, one by Professor Funabashi, who was the head of the Serum Institute those days in Japan, and the other one in Michael Clay. He was the head of IBM. He was the CEO of IBM UK. These two are independent studies, but they alluded to same theme of discovering the human purpose of business. Funabashi was looking at organizations which are over 100 years in Japan, and what is the common thread? What are the cultural foundations that you can see in these organizations such that they are so long lasting? You may be surprised to know that there are 12,000 and more companies in Japan who are more than 100-year-old. There are about 1,200 companies in Japan which are more than 200-year-old. There are about 50 companies in Japan which are more than 500-year-old. So how is it that these companies are long-lasting in spite of tumultuous changes in the external environment, changes in technology, changes in customer aspirations and requirements, employee expectations? How do they bring all this together? How do they constantly evolve, constantly change? What are the processes they have established? So when you look at that, the findings of that study by Funabashi is very interesting. He listed 3-4 things as what he noticed as common thread in all these 4 companies. He met up with the board of directors of all these companies, about 100 companies in Japan. And he said, what I see as a common thread in these companies, and the directors themselves explained to me, is as follows. Leadership-driven values, vision, standards of business conduct. Leadership demonstration of values and vision. This is what I was telling even Dr. Rohit Deshpande when he asked me, what are some HR policies that you have crafted and implemented in your company such that employees demonstrate such extraordinary commitment to their work and they're willing to give up their lives to save customers and to work and rise the bar of service to a world-class, world-beating level. What did you do? I said, look at this has been, I will not like to say that I implemented some HR policies and HR programs, and that is why this is happening. This is happening. What you see is happening. I know it's really amazing. This is happening because of a culture of performance, culture of selflessness, and culture of contribution that has been practiced by generation of leaders, starting with Jamshedji Tata, Jardi Tata, Ratan Tata. Some of these people, the way they have conducted themselves, the way they have cared for society and societal concerns, communities and environment, and the manner in which they have dealt with employees. Tata Steel has been some kind of a mecca. You know, it's a cradle of human resource management where most of the welfare-related legislations, which we talk today, whether it's Factories Act, there's ESI, Workmen's Compensation Act, and Bonus Act, some of these things were already being practiced, and it was existing as systems in Tata Steel in 1920s and 1910. So a culture is built over several decades, and it is transferred, and the senior leaders on the board are expected to take the baton and continue to strengthen this culture as they go into the future and as they plan to secure the future. These examples which I mentioned, I'll take just 2 minutes, examples. It is clear that company boards who have been empathetic to the human context of business and have supported and guided company managements in building lasting relationships with all multiple stakeholders, have responded creatively to changing environmental, socio, cultural, societal issues, have built internal talent pipeline, succession plans and internal talent pipeline, and provided adequate opportunities for human potential within the company to blossom. Companies like TCS, Tata Steel, HLL, etc. have joined hands to support and participate in national efforts of handling relief, rehabilitation of people in major national crisis issues, have commanded a unique respect and appreciation. So all these things leading to sustainable, lasting performance and success of such companies with their ability to withstand external shocks because the company's internal culture is so robust. The balance long-term requirements with short-term, the balance profits with environment and external society and communities. And this kind of balancing is done through establishing robust processes, which is tracked, which is measured for its performance, reported to the board. And NRC committees demand a report like this to be coming to them. NRC committee or the board committees require these kind of reports to be coming to them. Dissemination of code of conduct, dissemination of cultural credos and cultural pillars of the organization. All this is tracked, measured and tracked, and reports go to NRC and they debate it in the board. They reflect on some of these things and come up with suggestions so that the journey continues, journey of stability, sustainability, building performance-driven culture in these companies continue. So my specific recommendations are very simple. Processes and measures to determine the senior leadership is genuinely driving clearly stated values and standards of business conduct. These are measurable. We have put multiple measures in Taj Hotels and also several Tata companies where senior leadership effectiveness is measured for the compliance with values and also the leadership they provide to cascade these values at all levels of the company and expect that kind of conduct at all levels. Number two, emphasis on establishing processes and measures to track non-financial performance outcomes. One leads to the other. Non-financial performance outcomes and measures. So how serious are you to track non-financial performance measures, whether it's customer related, employee related, vendor related, or it could be society and community related? What are the measures you put in place? Are you tracking the way you're building relationships with these stakeholders? Number three, and the last point I have, is action plans implemented while responding to the findings of these trends, tracked on non-financial performance measures. Tracking non-financial performance measures is step one. Step two is what action plans are implemented in the company responding to the trends that are seen in these measures. So if this, as a recommendation, if some companies start doing this, if they are not already done, I'm sure many companies are following this, and some companies look at some of these non-financial performance measures, track its trends, and implement action plans to ensure that they show positive trends, you are building a strong culture within the company. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity given.
Thank you very much, sir. It was quite an informative talk with great examples. Now, since we are running out of time, I would request Mr. Anand Arup Ghosh to kindly come forward. Mr. Anand is a partner with Deloitte in Human Capital Consulting and leads the Workforce Transformation Service Line, an experienced professional in remuneration committees supporting executive pay, design, and board evaluation with a strategic focus in areas of HR. His area of specialization is across a range of industries, which include organization and governance structure design, etc. Prior to Deloitte, Mr. Anand headed AON's performance, rewards, and organization consulting practices across India, MEA and SEA sectorial. Over to Mr. Anand Arup.
Thank you very much. Thanks, and thank you for having me. I will just project my screen. So good evening, everyone, and I hope I'm clearly audible to all of you. I know we are behind schedule. Thank you. I know we are behind schedule, so I will try and wrap this up in as short a time as I can.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
What I wanted to do was, I have a completely different sort of a perspective from, I think, what has been shared, and it's only because I come in from a different view. I'm coming in from the view of someone who's been on the other side of the table, looking at the NRC or advising the NRC on some of the decisions. And a lot of the work that I fundamentally do has primarily been on the R of the NRC. It's not been on the end part of it so much. It's more the rewards remuneration part of it that I have focused on first. And it's also interesting because, and I think someone mentioned that a while back, that if you look at the NRC, the history of the NRC, it was always called the Compensation Committee. It's only the last 4 or 5 years that the nomenclature has changed to become the NRC, away from just pure compensation, and rightfully so, because the agenda or the charter of the committee was a little bit more focused on pay and promotions, etc., and the broader HR aspect, the governance aspect, the succession planning aspects were somewhat ignored in parts, and because it was being ignored by a committee of the board, in many places it was not given as much importance by the overall board itself, and it's falling by the wayside. So the fact that the NRC got created beyond just remuneration and compensation was a great move in parts. What I would do is, I don't want to spend so much time on the definitions and so on and so forth, but broadly, when you talk of remuneration, you're basically saying that the responsibility of the NRC is fundamentally about ensuring that there is a clear definition of how the organization should compensate its critical management personnel, its executives, on a year-on-year basis, depending on how they have performed. The nature of the compensation programs, and this goes beyond just the compensation for a particular year for a CE or a CXO, but the design of the programs, what kind of benefit structures, long-term incentive structures, variable pay structures, etc., should exist. And the third is, particularly when it comes to equity plans, companies have ESOPs and so on and so forth, management of their equity plans for organizations. These are very simply 3-4 aspects of remuneration that a company deals with. And I would imagine that to a large extent, the focus of the NRC often ends up being in ensuring that there is a very clear alignment between performance and compensation for the critical executives in the organization. And that is where, if you look at it, that is where the last few years has actually seen a lot of challenge come through. I mean, if you go back a couple of years, in 2008-9 onwards, post the global financial crisis, the focus on compensation, the discussion on compensation, etc., has accelerated a lot more. Prior to that, globally, people did not look at executive compensation with as much attention as perhaps has happened in the last 12 or 14 years. And that's largely because, again, the global financial crisis was accentuated by a lot by the way compensation structures were defined. Economists have talked about it. It's common knowledge. But what's happened now is that, and what you see in these two charts here is how proxy advisors, basically advisors who have been in the organizations that advise shareholders on how they should vote for remuneration proposals brought up by companies. So how proxy advisors have looked at the entire thing. And proxy advisors, interestingly, was again a new phenomenon in India. Till 5-6 years ago, India did not have any proxy advisors. Gradually, now it's a biggish industry that's also developed in India. So, but globally, it's always been a big thing. So proxy advisors globally have advised companies consistently on how they should vote on decisions related to pay. And if you look at the last few years, there has been a gradual uptick in terms of the number of times shareholders have come back and said no to a proposal brought up by a remuneration committee. Similarly, in India as well, if you look at the proxy advisors, there has been a lot of feedback about how proxy advisors have advised the shareholders on what they feel companies have done well. So if you look at, for instance, this chart, what it basically is saying, that the chart on the right side of the screen, it's basically saying that proxy advisors feel that less companies are able, even compared to previous years, lesser number of companies are able to adequately link performance with compensation for their senior executives. And while proxy advisors have been saying this about how compensation is determined, I think the other part is also media. And like I was saying, media has a massive role to play in the last few years in terms of driving the conversation around executive compensation. And pretty much every few weeks, you will find an article that talks about it. And it's fundamentally, if you look at it, it's very interesting news, right? Everybody likes to hear about someone whose pay is a little higher than theirs. And it's very human to find that to be interesting. And there is a lot of conversation that you'll find in media about executive compensation. The reason why I highlight these two, about proxy advisors and media, is that when you see a negative vote or a negative article that comes out about any company and their decision on how an executive is paid, etc., it is fundamentally a reflection on the judgment and the decision taken by the NRC. So in effect, when you're looking at all this happening in the last few years, for sure the focus has gone up, and maybe all of this was happening earlier as well, but there was not much focus. But in the last few years, as the focus has gone up, it has become far more important for the NRC to be very clear and accurate in whatever decision they're taking. And here's where I wanted to highlight a couple of points. And I'm sorry, I'm rushing this through a little bit, but I'm cognizant that it's a Friday evening, so I should give sufficient time for the rest of the evening as well. NRC's, in a sense, the remuneration part of the NRC is fundamentally premised on the fact that it will be subject to multiple conflicting pressures. At one end is management. Management has a very clear expectation of higher rewards with ideally lower risk. I don't know why this is happening on the screen for me, but I hope. Anyway, so some stuff is happening on the screen right now, but I know that. So it's so management's perspective is to get higher returns with lower risk. The shareholders' perspective is to ensure that there is complete awareness of why a particular compensation decision is being made and how it ensures that their value goes up. But here again, the challenge is that there is no one shareholder. A shareholder, there could be a Warren Buffett kind of a shareholder who will want to hold shares for 50 years, and there could be another shareholder who wants to sell tomorrow. Shareholders come with very different perspectives. Like typically, retail shareholders don't have much of a point of view on compensation. It's institutional shareholders who have a perspective. And institutional shareholders come with very different perspectives of their own. I mean, foreign institutional investors come in very, very different cultural nuances that Indian companies might not often think of as well. So you have a very, very diverse, but a very important constituency to adhere to, the shareholder constituency. At the other end is the regulator constituency. So the regulators in India have over the last few years also become a lot more active. So if you think about the Indian regulators, there have been changes in there have been different changes to the SEBI rules around on ESOPs. There have been changes to how that RBI has brought in terms of banking executive pay. Recently, the most recent one was the rule on asset management. SEBI brought in a rule on pay for CEOs and CXOs of mutual funds and how that needs to be modified. And there is every 6, 8, 9 months there is some industry or some regulatory body brings up some kind of a change in the overall structure. And then you have the other stakeholders, and the other stakeholders is the larger group. You have the employees, you have society, you have interest groups, etc., which all have their own needs as well. I mean, depending on where they're coming from, they will have their own set of dimensions that comes through. The role of the NRC becomes important because you have these very different pulls and pushes across all these different constituencies. Everybody has a very defined need. Many of it is not expressed very often. I mean, I guess management is the only one that expresses their need most clearly. The other groups express their needs in different ways. Sorry, I mean, regulators also come in with very clear expectations, but very different kinds of pulls and pushes on the overall structure. So therefore, from our perspective, when I look at what I would recommend, and I'm coming to this one quickly, is that I think there are 4 things that I would talk about. One is that, like I was saying, executive compensation practices have evolved tremendously over the last 5 to 7 years. And I think Shalini talked about the fact that you need to have some degree of external awareness and constant, like the Audit Committee has advisors, the Remuneration Committee should have advisors, etc. And I think the fact is that as things are changing for the Remuneration Committee, it's important for the committee to also constantly be abreast with whatever is happening in the industry. Now, here's an interesting thing in India. If you look at the typical board structure, right, and I'm happy to be challenged on this. If you look at typical board structure, the largest constituency of the board are people who come from either the legal background or the chartered accounting or financial background. And sometimes you have bureaucrats, retired bureaucrats. You don't very often find people who have a grounding or understanding of people-related issues coming into boards. You will find NRCs of large organizations in India, prominent large organizations, which does not have anybody who has a representation of this kind of a capability set. But here is the important part, and I think Kavinder put it in one of his slides. His deck started off by saying that the biggest decision that you can make is who you hire for your management team. So when the NRC is in a position where that is their biggest thing, and you have the whole board constituted of people who have no experience, I mean, they have experience of people management for sure, but who haven't gone through the whole routine of looking at it as a science, looking at it as their own practice. I mean, they haven't practiced HR. You end of the day have it's judgment based, and it's fine to be judgment based, but then it's also equally important to be abreast of what's happening. We often find, and like I said, in my job, I look at from the other side of the table. I often present to NRCs, and I find that to be a big challenge where there's not always a great amount of awareness of what it means to be doing something. And that results in wrong decisions and longer decision cycles. The other is that pay fundamentally is an extremely emotive topic. Like if you look at the last 6 months or last year with COVID, there has been enormous amount of discussion as to why should a person get paid so much, because there has been job losses, because there has been some other issues in the organization. And it's absolutely fair to have that discussion. But it's also important to ground it in business logic. I mean, when I see it, when you see it, or anybody sees it from an outsider's perspective, you're seeing it at a point in time. You're seeing an executive getting paid $1 million while 5 stores got closed or 2 factories got closed, etc. But you're not seeing the longer curve. You're not able to see what the executive has been charged to do over a 5-year period and how he has progressed on that curve. So it is emotive at a point in time, but it's also important for the NRC to realize that while it could be emotive, they have to stay the course. And I've often seen that decisions get taken or swayed because of the fact that how will the world see it? Will the world see it very negatively? And I'm picking up a point that I saw in Mr. Dube's presentation, where he basically said, you have to look at your next step, but also keep an eye on the horizon. And I think that's very important because of this, because today in a world that we are in, every NRC decision will be heavily scrutinized. But it's important to keep an eye on the horizon of what exactly or why a particular decision was taken in the longer scheme of things. And the third is, I think there's a strong conflict See, the basic theory of what compensation is tries to do is reduce the agency theory, which is that the management will want to behave in a particular way. It has to be aligned to how the owners want the management to behave. So the minimization of the agency conflict is what a lot of compensation principles are attempting to do. And the NRC is at the core of it. The NRC is the fundamental job of the NRC is to ensure that there is minimal moral hazard, potential for moral hazard, that management needs are adhered to, but moral hazard or agency conflict is constantly kept in mind. And it's not an easy one to do because management has more information, management has more data to be able to bring it up. So it's the NRC's job to ensure that they have, and again, I'm going back to Shalini's point that she made about ensuring that there's sufficient amount of information that the NRC has independently to be able to take a decision. And my last point is that organizations, unfortunately, have a tendency to not communicate on issues just pay. The regulators have pushed it down. There is far greater regulation around the fact that you need to disclose XYZ figures and so on and so forth. So while disclosure requirements have gone up, the fundamental nature of organizations is to not disclose, is to not communicate. Like if you think about it, historically, we've always said, why should I tell someone's salary? Why should someone's salary be out in the annual report? That's the mindset that we come with. But it's important, but the more the NRC takes a responsible stand towards communication, the less will be the challenges that I spoke about initially, about the media coming in a big way or the shareholder advisory boards coming in a big way. I'll just give you an example. Shareholder advisory boards, 98% of all proposals get passed. So as such, it's not like people get voted against. It is just that there is the negative comments that the shareholder advisors put out are the ones that impact share price. You can, and most of the times, if we analyze the negative comments that they put in, most of the time it's because of paucity of information. The commentary is all about the fact that we are fine with what you said here, but there is no logic for why you said it. And that is fundamentally what the NRCs need to start thinking a lot more, is to responsibly communicating as much as possible. I'm sorry I rushed through some parts of it, but I will close it here, and I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Anand, for the great talk and giving an insight as far as the NRC is concerned with respect to retaining the key talent in the organization. Now I move on to the question answer session. May I request Mr. Sundaresan to kindly take over?
Yeah, so I will try and take one question first. Let me start with Anand Rowe. Yeah? So Anand, today's increase in salary is at 5 to 6%. Yesterday's news says TCS has announced a 54% to Rajesh Gopinathan. A 54% increase, and to the COO a 60% increase. Okay, the median is nowhere near industry standards, which is 326:1. Now, let me ask you a very clean question. What do you think is NRC role in these hikes? See, we have a concept called say on pay. So who say and what pay are we even talking about?
Let's split it up into two parts. One is, so say on pay is shareholders say on the pay decision as proposed by the board. And the shareholder is well within their rights to basically say, I don't approve of this. Yeah. It's happened in India. Last year, there was a big one that was publicized, etc. So it's happened that the shareholder will say, I don't accept on this pay recommendation. It might happen in any of these companies. But while I have no awareness or understanding of TCS's decision pattern, my question is that if we look at, and that's where the challenge is, right? We are looking at two independent data points. One is to say that how much does the TCS employee earn, and how much is the TCS CEO getting paid. There's two very unique separate data points. The important thing is to see how is the TCS CEO getting compensated vis-a-vis other CEOs who are doing similar jobs that he or she is expected to do. Rajesh Gopinath is expected to perform a certain amount of responsibilities, is expected to grow share price at a particular level, etc., etc. For that job, how much should he ideally be getting paid? And if on that count, if a shareholder or someone can conclusively argue that this is not a fair pay, then that's a fair argument to have. But I think it's important to distinguish these 2 points and look at them independently of each other.
Follow-up question on that. The NRC recommends this huge hike. The shareholders say no to it. What do you think is the NRC's role when something is rejected by the shareholders? You think their capabilities are not good, or how is it?
I think the communication is not good. And I'm not defending for any role, but I'm basically.
It's not defend. I'm just taking your view. That's all.
So that's what I'm saying. So I'm not. So very often, it'll be rare for an NRC to actually has happened, will happen, but it is rare to have an NRC take a completely non-thought out view on something that is as drastic as what we're talking about.
Yeah. So
it would have gone through.
Yeah, no. Why I asked you this question is last two and a quarter hours we have been discussing on NRC. Is it anyway inferior to the audit committee? It is not. According to me, it is as good as an audit committee or on par with an audit committee. Right?
It's the same set of people.
Exactly. And when it comes to a decision, it is the same as an audit committee. And that is why I asked you, whether they lose their face or what happens in the general meeting. So I'll come back to you on that. Okay, just hold on. So Shalini, let me take one question from you. You have been telling about an external ally. Like audit committee has got the independent directors. You are worried that NRC does not have an external ally. So who do you think NRC can trust? And that too in a particular case like ILFS, where there was no ally. Everything was a lie. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
yeah.
I think one of the ways to get these independent external ally is like you have the auditors, we also need to get a committee of, whether it is proxy advisors or these independent bodies who benchmark to give the data so that NRC has an independent view besides what the management has presented. And that multi-source data is extremely important to be independent and not be colored by the management alone.
But again, you are coming back to only an internal source.
No, I'm talking about
auditor is an sorry. I'm
talking about an external source, external advisors. So whether it is proxy advisors or companies like I talked about, the Deloittes and the Hewetts of the world who are also advising. So like KPMG, EY, and all these guys are statutory advisors on the financial side. They need to be also providing compensation and remuneration advice independently, so that when the NRC gets the proposal, it is not only coming only from the management. So you want the big fours also inside the NRC committee? Like they present, like we invite the independent auditors for their view, we need to have independent auditors giving information which is independent on the compensation, remuneration, and other aspects as well. Okay, so you are saying you would still want an external ally in the form of any of these agencies. I'm not saying. Yeah, correct. Anand will just go very happy home, saying that, oh, one more business. But I'm just telling you, one of these biggies who can support you. Okay, I'll come to you. So HNS, let me just take you straight. Ravi Krishnamurthy has asked a question. What are the typical conflict or dilemma issues that NRC face? I would like to add an Infosys case where Rajiv Bansal was paid an exorbitant pay by the NRC. Is the NRC in a dilemma whether to retain the CFO or give him the pay and then get into whatever the public ire was, which is the Infosys case? So,
yeah, thank you for the question, and it's a very interesting question. I wouldn't like to comment on what Infosys board of directors did and a view expressed on that, but in principle, I'll answer the question that NRC has an advisory role. NRC can go into gather certain facts and details and analyze the facts and then come to a conclusion and make a suggestion and facilitate a decision-making process for the board. And that is the role of NRC. And as long as they have done that role, whether it goes in favor or against is not so, it should not be seen as extremely relevant. If it goes in favor, very good. If the board decides collectively that the decision is to go against, maybe there are reasons for the larger board to discuss and decide. As long as it is a speaking decision and a speaking order, it's fine. For instance, a situation arose in Tata Finance about 15 years ago when there was a big bungling that happened in Tata Finance, and investors were put at risk, and there was some bit of fraud that the CEO committed. I'm sure all of you must have heard it because it is in public domain. Everybody knows about it. And Ratan Tata did the best thing. He conducted a press conference, explained very transparently, this is what has happened. This is where we have made mistakes. And I apologize to all of you. He addressed the shareholders. He addressed the communities. He did a press conference. Everybody needs to know. Let it come in the papers. I don't care. But these are the facts. And he obviously he sacked the entire senior leadership team, all the 10, but he admitted some of the mistakes that had been committed in Tata Finance, and he took responsibility for it. See, sometimes some decisions get taken at the board level, and well,
it can go wrong.
Yeah, it may go wrong also.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Anand, the next question I think Ramanujam has for you is, NRC from a multinational company achieves better milestone versus an Indian company. So his question is, how do you compare? You know, when you said that, you know, you were speaking about Gopinathan's issue, and then you said it depends on one CEO against another CEO, whatever. So how does an NRC compare these figures and then take a decision and then remunerate a CEO or a senior management or whoever?
That is the point that I think Shalini and I were both talking about. That's the role of the external advisor, to basically to independently inform the NRC of what is the right kind of a compensation structure, what are the right kind of metrics or performance measures against which that compensation structure should pay out. And I don't think there is an MNC Indian company difference here. NRCs are company specific and not ownership type driven per se. But I think that's the role, right? To be able to find independent feedback.
So your solution is engage an outsider. When in doubt, engage an outsider.
Yes, because you have two choices, right? Either you take your own decision or you ask management. And when it is about the management, it is best that you take an informed decision from someone else.
Perfect. I think I go with you. Yeah. So to HNS, Sanjeev has asked, can the NRC committee directly interact with the organization, or it should be done only through the board?
Well, I think better done through the board. I mean, they can invite presentations, like I was invited to present on these entire rehabilitation efforts when the terror attack happened. I remember way back about 15 years ago when Kannan Devan Plantations of Tata Tea was being spun off into an independent cooperative, workers cooperative company. I could convince all the labor leaders, and because we were considering some kind of a VRS in Kerala, you know, hotbed of the communist unions and all that. And we came up with a program. When I made a presentation to the board, I found it difficult to convince Mr. Ratan Tata on some of the decisions we were taking about employees. And I had to go back again and again to convince him. And the board was actively involved. The board took such a keen interest in what's going to happen to the employees. These people have believed us for 3 generations. They've been with us. What this company is going to do to their lives, their families. So multiple questions were asked. I could answer most of those questions. Sometimes I had to go back, prepare, come back and do something new and come back and tell him, see, okay, based on your questions, this is what we have decided to do. So always it is better that NRC committees go through the board and take the permission of the board to intervene. They're most welcome to intervene. They can ask for instance, value dissemination in Tata Steel. He set up, J.J. Irani set up an internal communications department headed by Sanjay Singh. And it had some 35-40 people because they had 78,000 employees in 25 different locations. Tata Steel took up a vision saying that we want to become the lowest cost producer of quality steel in the world. Everybody used to laugh at them. In the world, have you heard of Nippon Steel? Have you heard of Uguvans? Have you heard of Korean Steel? What What do you mean in the world you will become the lowest cost producer of quality steel, but they actually achieved it? And because of exhaustive, comprehensive internal communication that they entered upon, that they launched, which was monitored by the board. A board director was asking for data on how we effectively have communicated in all these locations, including in the mines of Jharia and West Bokaro. You go down in the mines, several thousand feet, call a miner and ask him what is the vision of Tata Steel. You would explain and tell him, and tell you what is he doing differently based on the new vision announced by Tata Steel as compared to what he was doing earlier. See, this kind of complete dissemination, cultural dissemination was carried out by Tata Steel, which was by the board intervention. Board took charge of this.
So the point that I'm taking is communication. And from Anand, I'm taking saying that when in doubt, engage external advisor, which is what is, of course, Shalini's recommendation. Yeah, Shalini, you have something to add?
Yeah. On this point, I'd like to add one more thing. On the contrary, there are times that the NRC has to reach out to the employees and interact directly. And that's another matter. So I agree with what HNS has said. But for example, NRC, when it is taking the accountability and responsibility for succession, for selection of the right candidate for the CEO, then the exposure of NRC into the talents, into the organization is extremely critical, because only if you interact on a quarterly basis, you will not be able to do fair justice. So therefore, NRC must extend itself and get more exposure to the talents and the employees.
Yeah, Rajiv is asking me to close. So I'll close by saying Tata to the Tata man by asking one last question. Okay. You have mentioned non-financial performance indicators.
Yes.
Can you please, financial parameters is what Anand was discussing. So non-financial performance indicators and NRC, where do you connect it?
When you look at relationship building, see, building a successful organization is all about ennobling, progressive, mutually rewarding relationships you build with multiple role systems and stakeholders. That is most essential. And how do you build relationships? How do you understand changing customer needs? How do you understand changing employee aspirations and their career ambitions? How do you understand shareholder demands? How do you understand vendor needs and expectations? So there are processes today that are available internationally, and also a lot of Indian companies are following this. Establish those processes, understand what is it that they need. See, your definition of I have understood what you need, so I'm giving it to you is always deficient as compared to getting information from that role system, from that interest group. He's criticizing you. He's telling you, look at some of these areas you have messed up. You have not developed vendors. And when you don't develop vendors, when you don't develop dealers and distributors, a large company like Tata Steel or Tata Motors can't function. And what do dealers want? What do they want? And this is what we want, not what you defined as what you think we want.
Yeah.
So if you have established processes, if you collect data and information and analyze, present the findings transparently to all stakeholders. It's like mirroring, and take responsibility to commit yourself to addressing those needs, come up with an action plan, announce the action plans. The Taj hotels were among the top 15 globally selected hotels for employee satisfaction and engagement successfully for 4 or 5 years from 2009 to 2013. See, among the database of 2,000 companies worldwide, they select 15 best companies for employee engagement and customer delight and customer excellence. In that, Taj figured, because everything in Taj, what they noticed, we are doing transparently. The managing director scorecard, how he has performed on his 360-degree, HR manager, where he has made mistakes and where he needs to improve. It is all displayed, and we are willing to take feedback, and that feedback is all woven into an action plan, and that action plan also is presented, and we commit to implement the action plan. When a company practices this kind of transparent values, inclusion, I think a unique kind of culture that sets in, and initially it is threatening, but as you progress, as you keep doing it again and again, I think you get used to it, and the relationship becomes very strong, and they stand by you at your time of crisis.
Thank you so much, and it was wonderful asking questions, which is the easier job than answering. I know for that. Brigadier Rajiv, all yours. And
thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the time and deliberations which you made. Really grateful. We come to the last section of our program. Mr. R.G. Rajan shall deliver the closing remarks of the webinar. Mr. R.G. Rajan is a member of Governing Council of All India Directors of IOD. He is a former chairman of RCF and former chairman of SCOPE. May I request Mr. R.G. Rajan to briefly enumerate the recommendations made by the speakers and thereafter propose a vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Over to you, Mr. Rajan.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a very interesting discussion and informative webinar on NRC, the Game Changer Board Committee, which is responsible for shaping people, culture, and values. I would like to briefly summarize the main points made by all the speakers. Mr. Rajeev Dube, Mr. Arun Balakrishnan spoke first, and where he stressed the importance of NRC and also highlighted about the post-COVID effects on the people who are COVID affected, and how the NRC should have to address this issue and take care of this employee wellness and mental health in their activities. Mr. Dube, Rajeev Dube spoke on NRC focusing on unleashing the potential of people, systems, and organizations. He also said that the committee members should possess humility, good listening, and respect for others, ask the right questions, and avoid hasty conclusions. An important point he made was that the NRC should generate trust within the NRC and also outside, so that people trust the NRC and whatever decision they are taken in a fair manner. After that, we had Mr. Kavinder Singh who spoke, and he stressed on the people behavior, how we should select the people when you select on the NRC, how he selects the candidates for the right job. They should look for can-do and will-do people who are willing to go beyond the extra mile. Like Taj case, Mr. Srinivas mentioned about the Taj case where employees came back to work and came back to the hotel after the incident, having respect for people and creatively restless. They should be willing to do new things. And most importantly, working together as a team and own what you do. That was what the brief he was mentioned in his address. Ms. Shalini, when she talked about assessing the organization and the people performance in a very effective manner. And remuneration, does the reward and recognition motivate the talents in the company? She also mentioned about corporate ethics and governance issues to be talked in the NRC, and about the culture of the organization. And very importantly, on the robust leadership and succession planning. I think Mr. Srinivas talked on this process and measures to determine the senior leadership practices and drives have clear values and standards of ethical business conduct. And they should, and emphasizing on the establishing the processes and measures to track non-financial performance parameters, which we also discussed briefly by JS and Mr. Srinivas recently. And finally, we had Mr. Ghosh, who talked about a different perspective from everybody. And he said that the NRC is expected to manage conflicting challenges from the management, from the shareholders, from the regulators, and other stakeholders. And also evaluate and approve the design and adequacy of the compensation plans, policies, and programs. And ensure, most importantly, ensure the administration of equity-based plans and scheme, which also Mr. JS talked about, the compensation of the CEO and the CFO with the other people in Tata Group. Then further we come to the, I want to thank the sponsors basically. We have 3 sponsors, Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Limited, our webinar sponsor, NFL, our principal sponsor, and HR Limited, our associate sponsor. HPCL is a Maharatna company under the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, and it is in the top the Platts top 250 global companies. Its ranking is around 55 last year. And it has got around 25% stake in the oil sector among the public sector enterprises. And it has got 2 refineries in Mumbai and Vizag. It also has equity stakes in HPCL, Mittal Energy, and MRPL. National Fertilizer Limited is a mini Ratna company under Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. NFC has got 5 gas-based ammonia plants, 2 in MP, 2 in Punjab, and 1 in Haryana. And they have got 16% market share in India of urea. And they are the second biggest company in India in this sector. Besides, they also market the imported fertilizers like phosphatic fertilizers and potassic fertilizers, and biofertilizers and chemicals. The other sponsor was HR Leader Limited. Again, it's a public sector company under Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. It is a leading player in the field of crop protection and public health. And lately, it has also come into the field of marketing of fertilizers. So I want to thank all the 3 sponsors, HPCL, NFL, and HIL, for sponsoring our webinar. I also want to thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentation and excellent discussions. I also want to thank Mr. Sundaresan for his excellent comparing of the questions and asking some leading questions to the speakers. And also I want to thank all the participants. We had almost close to 200 participants for this webinar. I want to thank each and every one of the participants who came here and asked the questions and made it a very lively session. And finally, I want to thank Mr. Rajeev Kapoor and his team of IOD executives who have worked very hard to make this webinar a success. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the webinar today. I hope you all did find this webinar highly enriching, productive, and beneficial. Stay safe. Thank you very, very much. God bless.